Well, hello and welcome to episode 16 of Making a Killing, the podcast from Hudson Institute's Kleptocracy initiative on how corruption is reshaping global politics. I'm Nate Sibley, a Hudson Research Fellow, joined as always by my colleagues, adjunct fellows, Paul Massaro and Casey Michelle. And we're going to be discussing the latest news and developments from the world of transnational crime and corruption today. As always, your guides on our journey into the darker corners of the global economy. A few things have caught my eye this week. I'm just going to kick off with a few little headlines to get us started. Firstly, the big news from the start of the week that the US, the UK and Canada all issued sweeping new sanctions against the Lukashenko regime in Belarus, targeting what the US Treasury has called the regime's wallets, its major sources of revenue, formal or informal, including the potash industry, even the UK case, Belarus's sovereign debt. The US didn't do that. We can talk about that perhaps later on. Other news just fresh off the press, the Biden administration has announced that its much vaunted Summit for Democracy will take place virtually on the 9th and 10th of December this year, to be followed up by an in-person event hopefully at the end of next year. This is important for us on this podcast because fighting corruption is one of the summit's three pillars. The first time really that this issue is featured so prominently at such a high-level international conference. Other news, money laundering through real estate. There's a new study from Global Financial Integrity, one of our sort of sister think tanks here in Washington, do a lot of amazing data work. Do look up their work if you haven't already. A new study of 100 cases from the past 5 years found that a minimum of $2.3 billion have been laundered through US real estate. More than half of those cases involved a foreign official or some other politically exposed person, and 60% of those cases involve purchases in areas of the US where disclosure of ownership is not required. So fascinating look into the shady world of money laundering through real estate, which we talk about a lot on this podcast. No doubt we'll get to it at some point today as well. Just a couple of good bits of news on the asset recovery front. The daughter of the former Angola president and formerly Africa's richest woman, Isabel Dos Santos, embroiled in a massive corruption scandal. She's been ordered by a court to return $500 million in shares that a judge said were, quote, tainted by illegality. It's one of the last major assets she has, so she's really sort of on the ropes now, and a great credit to the investigative journalists, ICIJ and others who really dug around and exposed all that. Other last bit of good news for me, the US Department of Justice returned an additional $452 million connected to the 1MDB heist in Malaysia, bringing the total amount they've repatriated to $1.2 billion. Easily the most money that's been repatriated to a country after being seized because of corruption, at least as far as I'm aware of. So fantastic work by them. Of course, $4.5 billion was stolen from 1MDB, so we've still got just over $3 billion to find and get back to the Malaysian people. And then lastly, a sad bit of news. Senator Carl Levin, who was for many decades a huge bipartisan champion and an early pioneer of countering kleptocracy in Congress, passed away. He was, as I said, a pioneer in so many ways. He oversaw the still one of the most important case studies and early investigations of corruption in foreign money, corrupt money being laundered into the US when he oversaw the Senate Investigations Committee. So we can talk a bit more about his legacy as well as we go on. Chaps, that's enough for me probably. What have you guys been reading or listening to this week?
Well, I think you pretty much covered it, Nate. I think you just about got it, and I think that one thing I'd like to point out is that the Olympics just ended. And we've actually done a lot of fun work on anti-corruption in sport, on both on this podcast and at the Helsinki Commission and at the Hudson Institute. And just last Friday, a number of members of Congress introduced the Guaranteeing Oversight and Litigation on Doping, the GOLD Act, which will expand the Rodchenkov Act passed last Congress, which criminalizes doping in international competitions. So this Olympics, there were hints that doping took place. There were concerns that doping took place. A number of American athletes, British athletes, and so on and so forth complained that, just the very presence of the Russian Olympic Committee, right? It's pretty incredible that they were there at all after all of the incredible saga of state-run doping that the Putin regime has engaged in and has been completely undeterred. When there's this sort of lack of punishment, one kind of has to go from the assumption that why would they stop? In fact, why would any authoritarian regime stop? So at this point, we are expecting probably, and who knows what the timeline on this will be, anywhere from 6 months to a year to, 2. I mean, who knows, to see some indictment for doping fraud. Because, of course, one of the major, in some sense, the major innovation of the Rodchenkov Act wasn't just criminalizing it, wasn't just making it illegal in international competitions, it was redefining it as fraud. It was putting it squarely into the anti-kleptocracy space and enabling it to activate all sorts of other investigations. That's also the philosophy of the Gold Act, which makes it a predicate crime, doping fraud that is, for the racketeering, RICO, and anti-money laundering statutes, which were used back in the 2015 FIFA case and have been used again and again. For example, RICO was used to take down the Italian mob, to take down all sorts of different mobs, and so on and so forth. Casey, I see you're trying to jump in here, so jump in.
So Paul, regarding the Olympics, this gets actually to a question that we were talking about off mic earlier, and to what you were saying earlier, Nate, regarding some of the news of the week. Obviously, one of the biggest elements is this new package of sanctions that the U.S., as well as the Canadians, as well as British partners, issued. So this gets back to, on the one hand, conversations we've had earlier regarding corruption surrounding the Lukashenko regime, surrounding those financiers that are still bankrolling his regime, but also, on the other hand, this increasing emphasis on coordination as it pertains to broader Western sanctions packages, right? Think back to the earlier China-related sanctions packages that we saw coordinated from the U.S., U.K., EU, and Canada. One of the things that was I suppose, on the one hand, impressive regarding this coordination is that on the U.S. side of things, what we saw in the release that came out earlier this week is that it wasn't just these specific figures, specific entities, whether it's the potash industry, whether it's certain oligarchs, et cetera, regarding the Lukashenko regime, and obviously those who are now sanctioned because of the relationship with the Lukashenko regime. One thing that stood out to me was that the U.S. is now issuing sanctions against the Belarusian National Olympic Committee, the Belarusian NOC. And I'll just read a quick quote. The Belarusian NOC, quote, and this is the U.S. government saying this, quote, allegedly serves as a tool for Lukashenko and his inner circle to launder funds and evade sanctions, end quote. So it doesn't go into any further details regarding the kinds of mechanisms they use to launder money, the kinds of mechanisms they use to evade sanctions. But Paul, you were just talking a moment ago, this evolution of authoritarian Olympic committees, authoritarian relationships with domestic Olympic programs, and the kinds of doping activities, and now as we see, the kinds of laundering activities and sanctions evasion activities.
Well, that's exactly right, Casey, well. And all of these crimes are done together, right? One really important kind of theme always to be thinking about when fighting kleptocracy is criminals don't specialize, right? Criminals are always involved in everything. They're doing wire fraud, they're doing doping fraud, they're match fixing, they're laundering money, they're selling drugs, whatever it is, right? Whatever gets the cash, whatever can go under the radar, they're engaging in. And international sport is one of those places where you can really go under the radar. It's really an extraordinary opportunity for a lot of criminals, precisely because until 2015, that FIFA investigation was the first time you had any sort of accountability whatever, right, for criminality, for this kind of lurking authoritarianism in international sport. And I mean, that was only just a few years ago. So really, what we see here with these sanctions on the Belarusian National Olympic Committee are really extraordinary, and one of the first. I mean, among the first, this is certainly the first from Treasury, acknowledgement of, and I actually think, so it's not totally the first, because I just remembered, to jog my memory, that we had sanctioned Kadyrov's football club or something like that at some point. But with regard to the internet, that's right. Yes, Ramzan Kadyrov, who rules Chechnya with an iron fist, but one of Putin's cronies. But in any case, with regard to international sport, with regard to this massive international sport mafia, which is really, I mean, with this introduction of the Gold Act, Congress is really recognizing exactly how international sport operates like that. But I want to read this because I think it's very interesting, because it's from Treasury. It's from Treasury's release. It says, Lukashenko considers himself both a sportsman and a patron of sports, using international athletic competitions as a symbol of regime prestige and potentially as a conduit for financial crimes. I mean, that's really amazing. I mean, that's one of the best sentences I've ever seen for why are authoritarians so attracted to international sport? Because it's both regime prestige, and then it's also this really easy conduit for all sorts of other crime, because it's got this facade about it, right? It's got this quasi holy facade about it. That's, you don't touch sport. Sport is very special. There's this classic kind of like idea of the autonomy of sport. You kind of leave it's about the human spirit and all that kind of stuff. But then when you open it up and you look beneath, it is bleak. It is extremely dreary.
And we're only just beginning to get an idea of what is under the hood of international sport. We're only just beginning. In a similar way, Nate, you flagged earlier in the news rundown this fantastic new report that came out from GFI, Global Financial Integrity, on one of those other vehicles, one of those other popular, prominent vehicles for the laundering of money, for the injection of dirty money into the Western body politic, in this case, right into the U.S. itself. This was the report, Nate, that you highlighted on the transformation of American real estate, both residential and commercial, into this money laundering vehicle par excellence. I mean, I think the subheading of this fantastic and frankly overdue report really gets home to what this report is all about. It's why, I'll just quote this again, why U.S. real estate is a kleptocrat's dream. Now, this report pulls on only available data. You know, if you pull back a second, you think of the the American real estate industry still saturated in anonymity, still saturated in whether it's shell company purchases, whether it's purchases via things like American or U.S.-based lawyers that are protected by attorney-client privilege. You know, any number of vehicles, trusts, et cetera, any number of vehicles that allow for the anonymous purchase, and in certain cases anonymous then sales of or transfers of American real estate. We're only just beginning to scratch the surface of just how much this single industry has gorged at this trough of dirty money over the last 20, 30 years. Just to pick a couple stats that they pull out, right? So this is only from cases reported in the last 5 years. We're already talking about billions of dollars laundered through American real estate, because again, the U.S. is the only G7 country that does not require real estate professionals to comply with basic anti-money laundering laws and regulations. I mean, we're talking about the barest minimum of due diligence, of know your customer rules. If you have any amount of dirty money, my goodness, American real estate, commercial, residential, still remains wide open. 98% of the country is still wide open as a sieve for, as a vehicle for the transformation of dirty money into clean. Just to reiterate Nate's point, I can't recommend this report enough, and it's certainly overdue. And again, even just this one report still just scratches the surface of how bad things have gotten in this one sector, in this one country that we're talking about.
Right. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Well, I'd like to get your thoughts in here, Nate. I just wanted to add. I mean, it's like, these requirements don't exist at all outside of this one little space where you have geographic targeting orders and title insurers, but that are required to do some level of due diligence. But real estate professionals never. But I mean, even where they are in place, like, I mean, the UK has had them for some time, and we don't even see enforcement. So I mean, it's like we not only need them in place, we need enforcement. And I'm always trying to harp on this point of, I mean, look, I'm not an enforcer. I mean, the work that I do is all reform. It's all providing new authorities and that sort of thing. But if you don't have enforcement of those authorities, no amount of authorities will save you. So I mean, it's like, I don't know. I'd really hope that we kind of go to the furthest extent possible with enforcing what we've got, even as we attempt to build upon that.
Now, to be fair,
and it's worth delving back a bit. I think we've thrown around a few terms there that some of our listeners may be unfamiliar with, geographic targeting orders and so on and so forth. They're just, at least in the US, these all sort of stem from the passing of the USA Patriot Act back in was it 2001. And what happened there was various industries, but particularly like the banking industry, were required to flag suspicious transactions to the US Treasury by their customers. And originally, as drafted, that legislation included things like lawyers and real estate. I don't know if it had lawyers actually, but it had real estate agents. It had, people who sell yachts, people who sell Rolexes, that sort of thing. All the sorts of things that terrorist financiers, drug smugglers, and kleptocrats like to spend and hide their money on. Now, all of these industries, apart from the financial sector, managed to wriggle out with these temporary exemptions by lobbying the Treasury. Those temporary exemptions are still in place 2 decades later, and in full glare of what we now know about the extent of money laundering through those industries. So we talk a lot about shell companies and things on this podcast. The next kind of big push I think you'll see from the sort of anti-corruption community will be to remove those exemptions and get these people reporting suspicious transactions. But one of the interesting ways the Treasury has sort of tried to do what it can in the meantime, as you guys have mentioned, is these geographic targeting orders, which are actually, we sort of ragged on them a bit just now, but you hear people from the UK and the EU, they're quite jealous of them. They think they're quite a powerful tool. And just to quickly explain, in case listeners aren't familiar, what these do, in the US, there is this entity within the real estate industry called title insurers. We don't have them pretty much anywhere else in the world, I don't think. These guys, they research the sort of integrity of the title you have to your property, and they'll verify it and insure it for you, just in case it turns out that the documents that you think you're buying your house based upon, they're not actually they're not genuine, and someone else actually owns the land from like 200 years ago in some bizarre legal. So these guys actually have a pretty, I think, perhaps not always an easy job, but to me it seems like a pretty routine job a lot of the time. So the idea was, okay, they real estate agents themselves have this exemption from reporting under the money laundering regulations, but we can require title insurance agents to do due diligence on the background of people using companies, like usually shell companies, to try and buy property. And they then have to report that information to the Treasury. And in the first year that they did this, the Treasury found the reports they were getting in, 1/3 of the people involved in those transactions had previously triggered suspicious activity reports from their own banks. So there was clearly something going on here. And also in the first year, the amount of money involved in those sorts of transactions went down by, I think it was 95% in Miami. So they were, it doesn't mean that dirty money just disappeared and people suddenly start behaving themselves. They're obviously using other things. But 70% nationwide in all the different places that were covered. Yeah. So they work, and they're an interesting innovation. As you say, they're not the kind of like final, innovation we need to solve this problem. But the new report from GFI just pours fuel on the fire for the case.
Yeah, Nate,
to get that done.
One of the things that we talked about on this podcast before, and certainly that we've written on in the past, is this effort at translating these kinds of policy, these kinds of topics that we discuss, certainly the ramifications, to try to extend that beyond the kind of insular policy space that so much of us inhabit. Certainly sometimes these conversations can be just with a very small cohort, small group of individuals that focus on these policies and certainly understand these ramifications, rather than broadening out into kind of broader discourse, broader, American, British, Canadian, you have it, a discussion. Why do these policies matter to XYZ Main Street American, Main Street Canadian, et cetera, et cetera? Mm-hmm. I think one of the elements that you mentioned in the study that you just mentioned hits on exactly that. It's not just that these kinds of sales that have been previously suspicious or previously anonymous have dropped to such a considerable degree, and there have been such a clear outcome in favor of transparency that obviously all of us have been advocating for years. But it's also that housing prices alongside also dropped across the board in the areas that we have seen these policies implemented. Now, I don't need to explain to everybody how hot the housing market has been, certainly in the U.S. as well as elsewhere over the last few months. This is one policy, certainly among a number of others, that can, and as we've already seen, has already mitigated that kind of rising housing price, that kind of escalation in prices, so that Main Street Americans, Canadians, Australians, South Africans, et cetera, can have easier access to, greater access to the kinds of housing that is certainly much needed. And I just to flag, put my kind of selfish hat on for a moment. On that note, I just got notification today that folks can now vote for a panel that I and the OCCRP, Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project's Paul Radu, as well as legendary FBI agent Karen Greenaway, will be speaking on at the South by Southwest panel in Austin, Texas, coming up next year. It's called Dirty Money in Real Estate from Wall Street to Main Street. So if I can just plug that momentarily, please go online and vote for us, because we would love to talk more about this over some tacos and barbecue down in Austin.
Well, you got my vote.
Yeah. So, vote for Casey. So I wanted to pick up on that, because I think it's like it's great, and it's not, to me, it's not just, the real estate, the dirty money directly into real estate is a big part of it, right? But it's actually, it's even broader than that, right? It's dirty money period. It's the influence industry. It's the kleptocrat services industry. I mean, I look at like DC alone, where like the massive income inequality between a lobbyist or a Hill staffer, right? Look at like there was that report not too long ago that like, your average Hill staffer is making $30K a year, like that person cannot live in DC, right? And the ability, like the demand for luxury real estate, for really nice houses and that sort of thing, and really nice restaurants and so on and so forth, has just skyrocketed in these areas because you have more and more and more people coming in that are part of the influence industry, right? That are part of and I mean, who are demanding these influence services? Kleptocrats. Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's so much wider even than just directly dirty money into real estate. It's dirty money into law firms. It's dirty money into lobbying shops. It's dirty money into accountancies, auditing firms, whatever
luxury
it is.
Retail that then drives out local
Luxury
businesses
retail.
and local communities. Yeah, no, I mean, you can see it happening in every major city. That development is happening, the gentrification.
And you end up having, it's not just having piggy bank buildings, which I think are usually like the first thing considered when you think about dirty money. That is these kind of, the money that's like the Kolomoisky money or whatever that comes in and the building just goes dormant. But it's also the fact that you end up having huge swaths of Americans who become reliant upon dirty money.
Exactly. It's a trickle-down economy in a certain sense. It's dirty money that extends its tendrils into any number of industries because, lo and behold, the U.S. or the U.K. or France or whatever Western jurisdiction you'd like to choose has left itself wide open over the last 20, 30 years to these kinds of illicit financial inflows, suspect financial inflows, without any requirements for basic due diligence.
That's right.
And Nate, I think actually that to get back to one of the things that you mentioned earlier, just what I wanted to spend a moment on. You mentioned, in addition to the news, there was also a very, very sad passing last month of a long-serving senator from the American state of Michigan, a gentleman named Carl Levin. Now, if you've heard of Senator Levin, it's likely because he was one of these forces in the Senate. He spent much of his time on what is called the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. Gained much renown for his work at holding corporate executives' feet to the fire. Think back to the 2008 financial crash. Levin's efforts, his hearings, his investigations were seminal in helping uncover any number of trends that led to that financial crash, both before and then obviously the recovery or lack thereof afterward. But I just wanted to highlight one of the other elements of Levin's legacy that hasn't gotten nearly as much attention, but is very clear looking at this 20, 30 years later, is that he was one of the first, and as far as I can tell, certainly the most prominent figure that was able to early on identify the contours of what we now describe on this podcast and elsewhere of kleptocracy. That is to say, the transnational transferring of illicit funds through Western jurisdictions, through Western industries, to launder not only those funds themselves, but then the reputations of those individuals, of those regimes, of those oligarchs themselves. I don't know that Levin himself ever necessarily described this phenomenon as kleptocracy, but it's very clear in reading through the historical record, in reading through the hearings of the 90s and the 2000s, that he and his staff were very clearly ahead of their time, that he and his staff were very clearly able to see the contours of what these kinds of kleptocratic networks, these kinds of kleptocratic regimes would end up growing into, because the kinds of policies that Levin and his staff and his colleagues advocated were not eventually implemented. I know, Nate, you mentioned a moment ago the Patriot Act, obviously any number of concerns and criticisms regarding civil liberties violations with the Patriot Act, but looking back 20 years, it is eminently clear that the Patriot Act is not only the greatest a single piece of anti-money laundering legislation the U.S. has ever passed, but you could argue that the world has ever seen. If you go back to the 1990s, the American banking sector, it was like the Wild West back then. You could drag in shrink-wrapped piles of money. It didn't matter what the source was. You could work with any corrupt oligarch, any figure. There was no law whatsoever against processing the proceeds of foreign corruption. There was no law against working with any bank that you like, even shell banks, which are these, similar to shell companies, banks that existed only on paper. And it was only because of the efforts, the hearings, and then the efforts led by Senator Levin, his staff, and his colleagues, that shined a light on just how much damage these banks, the paucity of regulations, were doing. And that's why we ended up getting the legislation within the broader Patriot Act that made all of this illegal, that finally began cleaning up the American banking sector. Now, obviously, it still has any number of issues. To get back to Paul's comment a moment ago, the issues of enforcement, issues of resourcing are absolutely still there. But because of Levin's work, because of Levin's legacy, the American banking sector and the efforts to clean it up are absolutely a success story and absolutely a model worth emulating as we begin moving to these next sectors, these next industries moving forward. So I just wanted to highlight Senator Levin's legacy in this space. There was nobody like him. There was nobody that was able to identify these contours. There was nobody certainly that was able to bring these to the fore, as any number of oligarchs or regimes in Angola, in Equatorial Guinea, in Mexico, in Gabon can certainly attest. He made enemies around the world from all the worst people. I think what we're doing today is certainly an attempt and an effort to carry that legacy forward, and many of the successes we will encounter moving forward are in many ways due directly to what he laid out in the 90s and the 2000s. And I hope he rests in peace.
I think that's true, Casey. And I think for me, one of the interesting things about Senator Levin was that he saw so early on the threat of transnational corruption and kleptocrats, as we call them now, at a time when all those reforms you just mentioned were actually being driven forward by broader concerns about first the drugs, the war on drugs and the war on terror. And that's those were the lenses through which everyone else in DC was kind of murderously looking at ways to try and hunt down dirty money and desperately looking for ways to do that, realizing that the cartels and then Al-Qaeda and whoever else you want to name basically viewed the US financial system as open season.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Finish up.
No, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to say, it's like, yeah, I mean, Casey, like everything you're saying is, absolutely seconded, and what an extraordinary figure. And of course, I mean, this is another one of these examples. I think again and again and again in my life, in the human rights and anti-corruption space in particular, it's just Congress always leads the way. And it's just, for as goofy as that wonderful institution can be sometimes, like, thank goodness we have it, And I mean, it's the fact that we have this independent legislature totally removed from the executive branch. The first article of the Constitution, we get this sort of a person, right? We get these people who can lead outside and sometimes in opposition to executive branch priorities. And thank God they can do that, right? I mean, because as you say, Nate, I think that, until even just a few years ago, terrorism was it. I mean, it was just constant concerns about terrorism. And I mean, especially as we now...
Not wrongly, but it just wasn't the only threat. It sort of edged everything else out the door, didn't it? It
did, and it did. And I mean, look, there's a double-edged sword here when it comes to the war on terror, and that's kind of what I wanted to just delve into real quick, because I've been thinking a lot about this as we, leave Afghanistan. Which after 20 years, it's been a long time, and almost immediately we now have most of the country controlled by the Taliban. I mean, it does have echoes, I think, of the American withdrawal from Vietnam, and I mean, it certainly seems like, well, it's been 20 years, so I think that when you evaluate the war on terror, I think that, there's a lot of criticism one can levy at it. I think on the other side, as Casey says, with regard to the Patriot Act, which was certainly a product of the war on terror with the abolition of shell banks and all sorts of other due diligence requirements, some of which still have not been implemented, yet to be implemented. But in any case, tightening down the hatches on the financial sector, and also sort of for the first time thinking about finance in the sense of like, okay, how do we eliminate networks? In some sense, we have to kind of take another look at the war on terror and not think about the military aspects, or at least put them to the side for a second, and think about the financial warfare aspects that came out of this, because a lot of the targeting that was used, a lot of the targeted sanctions, a lot of the due diligence requirements, a lot of this sort of thing, these are exactly the tools that we have to use against kleptocracy, and we have to do them in the same way. So we're in this very odd position right now where we want to go back, right? Where our national security wants to go back to great power competition. That's what everybody sort of talks, great power competition. But we can't do that because what we're really talking about are networks of kleptocrats, right? And we know how to fight networks because we very, very, very effectively did it against terrorist networks. We blew up their financing structures. And that's really something. We could do the same thing to these kleptocrats if only we had the will, if only we had the wherewithal.
I was going to say, Paul, to that point, there are a few figures who recognized the overlap, the commonalities, and then within that, or following that, the kind of shared policy overlap required to obliterate these kinds of malign networks, whether they are terrorist or terrorist financing networks or kleptocratic or kleptocrat services networks themselves. I just want to pull on one quote. I know I was just talking about Senator Levin a moment ago, but there was a hearing that he oversaw in 2004, looking at as we now recognize, 15 years on. Again, he wasn't using terms like kleptocrat or kleptocracy, but he was talking about the exact same thing, and he has this great quote. Where this was 2004, this is obviously well into both Afghanistan and Iraq, but also as these kinds of network developed, sanctions-related tools were developing. He had this great quote. He said, quote, "Osama bin Laden boasted that his modern new recruits knew the cracks in the Western financial systems like they knew the lines in their hands." And he was exactly right. This is a story for a longer episode.
That could be about kleptocracy.
Exactly. You see the commonalities, you see the overlap, and yet we still have this kind of dissonance as it pertains to, certainly on the one hand, recognizing the threat that kleptocracy poses in a very similar and if not greater way to the threat that terrorism boasted then and continues to boast now. But the kinds of required policies to dismantle these kinds of networks, because we're not talking about specific individuals, we're not talking about specific regimes. These are transnational networks operating in multiple jurisdictions, certainly for the furtherance of their own financial ends, but also for the eventual dismantling of what we have known and certainly come to enjoy as liberal democracy itself on this planet. Regimes dedicated to, or governments dedicated to transparency, to the upholding of the rule of law, and to human rights themselves. Senator Levin recognized it. He advocated for policies that crossed both of those barriers, terrorism and kleptocracy, and it behooves us to continue in that path.
If I may, just popped into my head, but if you're interested in Senator Levin's legacy, not only that, but all of the issues that we've talked about pertaining to financial transparency, and financial efforts to go after kleptocrats and what works and what doesn't. The great book to read is by Senator Levin's former chief counsel, Elise Bean, who is also the sort of fairy godmother of the US anti-corruption community.
She's
a wonderful lady and just incredible wealth of resource and knowledge for all of us to talk to. But her book is called Financial Exposure, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, that's correct.
And it is her account of her time working for Senator Levin and all the oversight that he did to try and clean up the financial system, not just domestically, but also against foreign influence as well. It's a fantastic read, and it goes into a lot of detail about all these issues like geographic targeting orders and all sorts of things. So it's a very, very much this week's recommended reading, I think, in light of Senator Levin's sad passing. Finally, I think, Casey, you had an interesting article out this week. I don't want to go too much down the sort of culture wars rabbit hole, but it flagged an interesting country that we haven't talked about too much. This week, as some of you may be aware, because it's all over Twitter and all the rest of it, Tucker Carlson, the Fox News host, has chosen to broadcast from Hungary, holding up the premiership of Viktor Orbán as a model for conservatives in the US to emulate. Casey, you had... you published, and he said something like, if you care about the future of our civilization, you need to know what's going on here. Casey, you agreed with him, right? But maybe for different reasons.
Thanks, Nate. I mean, I don't think we need to go too into the weeds of, certainly some of the rhetoric that's been shared over the last week, whether it's from Mr. Carlson himself or his conversations with Prime Minister Orbán or any of the members of Orbán's government themselves. But I do think there was an interesting entry point into, so much of the coverage regarding Orbán, so much of the coverage regarding his visit from Orbán, certainly it centers on policies targeting whether it's members of the LGBT community, whether it's members of the free press. Certainly, I wrote about that in the piece. But one of the things that I wanted to pull on for our conversation today, and certainly that didn't see nearly as much prominence as I would have liked over the last week, is the role that corruption, transnational corruption, elite predation, state capture, et cetera, plays in the Orbán government itself. Now, I'm not speaking on behalf of myself. I'm just speaking on behalf of a number of other investigative journalists on a number of other pro-transparency organizations. And I'm talking specifically about pro-financial transparency, pro-good governance, pro-due diligence organizations that have already written far more extensively than I have on the matter of corruption within Orbán's government, and then the role it plays in transnational corrupt networks themselves, or what we describe as kleptocracy. I mean, I think it's worth pulling on just a couple data points. So, for instance, Transparency International now ranks Hungary lower than dictatorships in places like Belarus or Cuba in its corruption perceptions index. And we're talking about everything from systemic fraud that funnels billions of dollars to regime insiders to, again, specifically corruption within Orbán's inner circle. Freedom House says that it has evolved into a crony capitalist state par excellence. And there was a wonderful article in The Atlantic not long ago that quoted a local official that says nobody can be rich in Hungary without having some relation to Orbán. I think, again, so many of our conversations deal specifically with kleptocratic dictatorships, again, in places like Belarus, again, in places like Cuba. But what I think Orbán's regime illustrates is that these types of governance structures, these forms of elite predation, of state capture, and then of using the kinds of offshoring or financial secrecy vehicles we see out of Moscow or out of Kazakhstan or out of Beijing or out of, pick whatever kleptocratic regime you'd like, can also, and as we've seen in Hungary, will also develop in Western partners, in nominal democracies, in countries that are close allies of the US, of the UK, and are obviously members of the European Union themselves. So anyways, I just wanted to highlight that reality, that relationship, and we don't have time to go into the manifestations of how that's upended domestic politics in Hungary, but it's no surprise that these kinds of networks have bloomed in Budapest under Orbán and have created this kind of reinforcing mechanism that the deeper they get into the state structures, the greater the state capture is, and then it just manifests and reinforces itself thereafter.
No, it's great. It's become a huge... Sorry, yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Well, yeah, sorry, we kept talking over one another. I just wanted to add that, it's like everything Casey says is correct. Kleptocracy cannot exist in a vacuum, though. This is the thing: is these states that build these kleptocratic governance structures rely on enablers, and I mean, in this particular case, Hungary is pretty small, relies on the enabler of Germany in large part because the German car industry is a huge part of Hungary's economy, and I mean, and not a dissimilar way as in a larger scale, you have all of these Western companies with business interests in China, right? And it goes both ways. There's leverage both ways. But at the end of the day, Germany is the much bigger state. It's the much more powerful state within the EU. It's the one that has allowed this to occur, immediately, sort of right there to its south. And I mean, it's one of these things where I think this idea that dictatorship is something that happens over there and there's nothing we can do about it, and it's completely incorrect. In almost every single case, the rise of kleptocracies relies on access to Western markets, or access to Western financial systems, or access to Western professionals, or all of the above.
And it's one of the interesting ways that plays out is in the relations between the EU and the Orbán government, which is an increasingly corrupt, sort of like increasingly authoritarian leader of an EU country. Not in the way that we've done shows in the past about Malta, for example, also an EU country that has become kind of a cesspit for money laundering. just by virtue of the volume of like dirty money and its raison d'etre was to launder money, and that eventually just rubbed off. There's also, Hungary's a bit different in that respect, I suppose, in that he's a genuine sort of authoritarian leader. He seems to have close affinity for other authoritarian. For example, he routinely sort of blocks efforts to hold Russian, China to account or to stand up to them. Right. He's the kind of veto guy in the room for all the stuff that the EU tries to do when it comes to protecting and advancing democracy around the world. And he's in a tiff with them at the moment about, the state of rule of law in Hungary and about, the huge COVID relief fund that the EU is providing for its member states. And Hungary isn't eligible for it at the moment because of the rampant state of fraud and the many investigations which have shown how this money will inevitably just be funneled off to cronies of Viktor Orbán. But it's a good example of how someone builds a sort of corrupt network to keep themselves in place, and then they end up having a very a difficult role in the community of democracies, and then they end up kind of being outright friendly to some of the biggest threats to democracy, like the Putin regime.
That's exactly correct. But to me, and see, I always think about what can we do, right? And to me, the big thing is always just how this stuff happens. I mean, on our watch. I mean, what have democracies done as kleptocracy has taken over, as kleptocratic networks have solidified themselves, as it got entrenched in everything? Nothing. I mean, it's really amazing in this case to see just how powerless the EU seems to be vis-a-vis Hungary. I mean, what can be done here? I mean, what about there's so many cases of this, right? With the EU and say Poland with this Article 7 procedure that never took off. The EU tries things. They tried to build this European Public Prosecutor's Office, and then Hungary just said, "We're not joining." And what are you going to do about it?
One of the problems of the EU is that it was founded on the principle that everyone would want to be a willing and enthusiastic member, but of course decades down the road things have changed, and they have the sort of things to deal with, the ways that you might apply pressure to people like that. They're not baked into the EU's initial sort of founding structure, and I think short of invoking Article 7 or withholding funds here and there. As you say, there's not much you can do, really.
And the WTO and the FATF and the UN and so on and so forth are not the EU. The EU is a much tighter, much more. But to me, this is what it is, right? This is exactly correct, Nate. Is we have integrated ourselves with kleptocracies under this idea that they would be good faith participants, even if they're dictators. And it's like, wow, we've had to go the hard way to come to the realization that we really should have been able to recognize very early that they're not good faith implementers of this sort of thing. Everybody that joins your club isn't going to be an enthusiastic participant. And once they're in your club, all your leverage is gone. And this isn't just the EU. I mean, it's like there's so many international organizations where we see this as the case now, where we see the influence of one country, one normally kleptocracy, just throwing wrenches into the gears of everything. And it's so easy for them. And it turns out there's really nothing you can do short of finding sort of coalition of the willing style groups and fighting back, which I mean, to be honest, is what the strategies become, right? I mean, at the end of the day, what are Magnitsky sanctions? What are sort of group visa bans? What are, looking at the transatlantic space and so on and so forth, except to say that to some extent, yikes, a lot of these organizations aren't getting the job done.
Exactly. What does that say to the potential member states moving forward as well? To say nothing, the current member states, obviously members of the Polish government, are watching everything that Orbán and his government are doing and rubbing their hands in glee, knowing what they can get away with. But what are the folks down in Belgrade or in North Macedonia? What are they looking at and seeing what they can get away with, et cetera?
I really do think deterrence in this space has been a disaster. I mean, I think that's why we saw that Lukashenko engaged in the second kidnapping at the Olympics, right? Lukashenko then apparently hanging this dissident in Kiev, right? I mean, this transnational repression is going nuts. Kleptocracy. I mean, and still we don't see, the kind of deterrence that would be required to really get in the heads of these individuals that they've got to stop this. So I don't know. I mean, it's hard for me not to feel like we've got to rise to our values and to our ideals, and it just can't be these bad guys abroad. It's got to be us saying, okay, enough's enough.
Paul, I might need a drink immediately after we finish recording this.
Well, on which note, we are coming to time, Casey. So crack one open by all means, because that's about all we've got time for this week. So hope you've all enjoyed the chat and found it insightful as much as I did. Remember, if you are enjoying the series, to subscribe, share it with your friends, and if you can give us a good review on Apple Podcasts, that always really helps us out as well. We'll be back next week. As previously mentioned, we've moved to a weekly format now, and we're doing every other week. You'll hear from Casey and Paul and I discussing news and developments like we've been doing, and then every other week from that, you'll be hearing from an interview between one or two of us and someone on the front lines of the fight against transnational crime and corruption. So we'll be back next week with one of those. But that's it from us from now. So thanks very much, and we'll see you again next week.
Thanks, Nate.
See you later.